Hello, and welcome back to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, and I am thy host. And today's chapter is Genesis 42. Let's go ahead and read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. And while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 42 has 4 verses short of its chapter number, has 38 verses. Let's go ahead and read them. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" And he said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them, and he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." He said to them, "No, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see." And they said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you. You are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother, while you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there is truth in you. Or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies." And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Joseph said to them, "Do this, and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. So your words will be verified, and you shall not die." And they did so. Then they said to one another, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us." And Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." They did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, and to replace every man's money in his sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them. Then they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money in the mouth of his sack. And he said to his brothers, "My money has been put back. Here it is in the mouth of my sack." And at this their hearts failed, and they turned trembling to one another, saying, "What is this that God has done to us?" When they came to Jacob, their father, in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, "The man, the lord of the land, spoke roughly to us and took us to be spies of the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men. We have never been spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is this day with our father in the land of Canaan.' Then the man, the lord of the land, said to us, 'By this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, and take grain for the famine of your households, and go your way. Bring your youngest brother to me. Then I shall know that you are not spies, but honest men. And I will deliver your brother to you, and you shall trade in the land.' As they emptied their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, 'You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me.' Then Reuben said to his father, 'Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you.' But he said, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol." So there you have it. That is the text of Genesis chapter 42. This is where, the story has been interesting the whole time, but this is where it really gets kind of intriguing here as we see a great turn of events in the situations of Joseph and his brothers. So let's remind ourselves of where we've been and what we've talked about specifically in the life of Joseph up to this point. We were reintroduced to Joseph, and his story kind of really takes off when he's 17 years old. His brothers hate him. They hate him for a couple reasons. Number one, he's the favorite of his father. And another reason is because he has all these dreams. He has these dreams that his brothers, who are many of them older than him, are going to bow down to him. Even his father and his mother are going to bow down to him. And his brothers hate him for this because he tells his brothers and the rest of his family about his dreams. And they're like, "We're not going to bow down to you. What are you talking about?" And so one day, while they're in the field, in the pastures, caring for the sheep, Joseph comes to them, and the brothers decide that they're going to kill Joseph. That's how badly they hate him. But then they change that plan, and they decide, well, let's not kill him. We don't want blood on our hands. Let's sell him instead. So they sell him to some slave traders who are headed down to Egypt, about 500 miles or so to the southwest of their home in Canaan. So Joseph ends up going down to Egypt. There he's sold to a man named Potiphar, and he serves in Potiphar's house very faithfully until Potiphar's wife lies about him, and then Potiphar, believing his wife instead of Joseph, throws Joseph into prison. Joseph's in prison for several years until he meets two individuals, a cupbearer and a baker. These just so happen to be the chief cupbearer and the chief baker for the king of Egypt, Pharaoh. And one day they have dreams, and Joseph interprets their dreams, and those interpretations come true. The chief cupbearer goes back to Pharaoh to get his job back. And Joseph asks the chief cupbearer, "Hey, will you put in a good word for me with Pharaoh, because I'm in this prison and it's on false charges. I haven't done anything wrong. Could you maybe get me out of this situation?" Well, like any good friend, the cupbearer forgets about Joseph. Like any bad friend, he forgets about Joseph for 2 years until Pharaoh has a dream. And that's what we talked about in the last chapter. Remember, Pharaoh dreams about the 7 plump cows and the 7 skinny cows, and then the 7 fat, healthy ears of corn or ears of grain, and then the skinny, blighted ears of grain. When no one is able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, the cupbearer finally has his memory jogged. He's like, oh, there was a guy in the prison that I was in who could interpret dreams. And so they summon Joseph out of the prison, and he appears before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh asks him, "Can you interpret dreams?" And Joseph says, "I can't do it, but God will give me the interpretation." So Pharaoh recounts his dreams to Joseph, and Joseph says that his dreams mean the same thing. The meaning, the prediction, or the prophecy of these dreams is that there's going to be 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt, and then there's going to be 7 years of a really, really bad famine. So what Pharaoh needs to do is he needs to select a wise man to oversee this situation, to collect part of the grain in the abundant years, save it up for the 7 years of famine that are coming. Well, Pharaoh says, well, who else would I pick other than you, Joseph? Clearly God is with you. Clearly you're a man of discerning and a man of wisdom. And so all of a sudden, Joseph goes from being a prisoner at 30 years old to being the second in command over all of Egypt, tasked with preparing the land for this famine that's coming. And Joseph is married in the last chapter. He also has 2 children in the last chapter. So he's governing over Egypt just under Pharaoh when the chapter concludes in chapter 41. And as chapter 41 is being brought to a close and 42 is opening our text for today, we're getting into the 7 years of famine. And what we're seeing is that all the earth, all the other nations around Egypt are having to come to Egypt to buy food. because they're the only ones who knew about the famine ahead of time and stored up food, all thanks to Joseph, and really all thanks to Joseph's God. And guess who's going to have to come down to Egypt to buy a little food for their family? We'll talk about that as we get into our outline section, but let's go ahead and go to our PDF, which, by the way, you can download all this information that we're going to go over on our PDF. We have one for every chapter of Genesis. They're free on our website. They cover all the key details. And also, if you would like to buy it in a physical book, it's available on Amazon.com. So we've covered our context. Now let's go over a little of the foundational information for this chapter, as we always do. First of all, we ask, when did these events happen on our Bible timeline? Joseph was 17 years old when he went to Egypt. That was approximately 1728 BC. Joseph was 30 years old when he became the ruler of Egypt in the last chapter. That's approximately 1715 BC. The 7 years of abundance that were foretold in Pharaoh's dream, they had passed. They passed in the last chapter. And the 7 years of famine have now begun. Therefore, these events occurred at least 20 years after Joseph was sold as a slave into Egypt. So quite a lot of time has passed, even though it's just been a couple chapters in our reading. Let's talk about our key characters for today. First of all, we have Joseph. Joseph was Jacob's son with Rachel, his favorite wife. In this chapter, he is the governor of Egypt. He's the second most powerful man in Egypt, and really one of the most powerful men in the world at this point. We have Joseph's 10 brothers. They were the ones who originally sold Joseph into slavery when he was 17. In Genesis 42, they end up traveling down to Egypt themselves to buy some food because they've run out of food because of the famine. We have Benjamin. This is Joseph's 11th brother, the only other son of Jacob and Rachel. And Rachel, remember, actually died giving birth to Benjamin. And then we have Jacob, who is also called Israel, and you'll hear him actually called both in this chapter. God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. He is the father of Joseph and his brothers. He was the son of Isaac and the husband of Rachel and Leah. And now let's consider our geography. This is going to be pretty similar to what we've seen in the last couple chapters. We have our expanded map widening out from the land of Canaan and looking to the southwest to the nation of Egypt. Egypt's exactly where it was, or where it is, on a modern map towards the south of the Mediterranean Sea. Joseph's brothers have to travel from Canaan to Egypt to buy food. As I mentioned, that's about 500 miles approximately, if my map reading is correct. We're not told exactly where in Egypt Joseph was located and where he was governing and selling all of this food. We just know that it was somewhere in Egypt. As we go over into our outline section, what we're going to do is break the chapter down, make sure that we understand what we just read, and as we open up this chapter, the providence of God, God's will and how he works his plans out in the world is just so evident. Joseph got sold down to Egypt, and his brothers probably thought, we're never going to see him again. At this point, they don't even know if he's alive anymore. But they're like, we don't have any business. We're not going to be going down to Egypt. There's no chance that we're going to run into him again. Well, God had other plans. They are going to take a trip to Egypt, and we're going to see the script basically flipped on them. They had power over Joseph to do whatever they wanted, and they sold him into slavery. Now, the roles have reversed. So let's talk about verses 1 through 5 first. Jacob sends his sons to Egypt to buy food is the title of this section. Not long after the 7-year famine began, Jacob told his sons to go down to Egypt to buy food. So word seems to have spread pretty quickly that, hey, Egypt is the place where you need to go to get food. They're the only ones who have it. And so Jacob's family is running out of food. He had a lot of people in his household and a lot of livestock in his household to feed. So he needs some additional supplies. And so hearing that Egypt has food, he sends 10 of his sons down to Egypt to get it. Now, Jacob didn't send his 11th son, Benjamin, his youngest son, because he feared that something was going to happen to him. Benjamin is his favorite, it seems like, and he is the son, or he is what Jacob believes is the last living son of his favorite wife, Rachel, because he doesn't know. He thinks Joseph is dead. So he's he's protecting Benjamin. So he sends the other 10 sons down to Egypt to do this job of bringing back food. Benjamin stays with him. This brings us to section number 2, verses 6 through 17. Joseph meets his brothers in Egypt. So Joseph is the governor of Egypt at this point, and everyone has to come to him to buy food, and it seems like he kind of vets them and makes sure that they're people that he actually wants to sell to. So Joseph's brothers end up appearing before Joseph and bowing down to him. Interesting. He recognizes them as his brothers, but they don't recognize him. Okay, so keep in mind, there's been 20 years plus that's passed here, so age obviously changes people in the way that they look, but Joseph at this point is probably also dressing culturally different. He's probably dressing like the Egyptians. Maybe he has a shaved head like the Egyptians in all of the movies and all the hieroglyphs. Maybe he's wearing that eyeliner that they seem to like to wear, at least in the popular pictures and in the popular movies. We don't exactly know what their dress was like during this particular era of time, but Joseph is a different man. Culturally, he's very different. He's now assumed the second, not the throne, but the second in command of Egypt. He's an Egyptian. And no doubt he took on their customs, their culture, their dress, their attire, their look, their aesthetics. And so he's 20 years older and he looks probably significantly different. So he looks at his brothers, they're dressed probably like they were 20 years ago. He says, I know these guys, but they don't recognize him. And the text says that after they bowed down to him, Joseph immediately remembers his dreams, the dreams about the sheaves and the stars from chapter 37. And so this is why I keep mentioning those dreams and bringing them up, and why we've talked about how dreams are so significant in the story of Joseph. So you got Joseph's dreams early on in chapter 37. You've got the chief cupbearer and the baker's dream. You've got Pharaoh's dream, and now you see the fulfillment of Joseph's dream here. So very significant in this whole story. And I think this is part of the reason that the story of Joseph is so popular. One of the reasons that we go over it so often in churches or Bible classes is because it plays out like a movie, and we're gonna see that it's like a script that somebody would write for a movie today. You've got this intrigue, you've got this, the plot is being set up and prophetically in the beginning, and it's being fulfilled in the end, and it's just a fantastic story, and it's a beautiful display of God's work. And no doubt, a lot of our storytelling as human beings is based off of this kind of framework that God has set up in the story that He has told through His will and through His providential working in the world. So his brothers bow to him, and he immediately remembers those dreams that he had about his brothers bowing down and recognizing, those were from God. Those were indeed pointing to the future, even though no one saw how that was going to come to pass in our lives. And there's probably a lesson there for us as well, is that sometimes God makes us promises through His Word, and maybe we end up in situations in life where we're like, I don't see how God's promises are going to work out. I don't see how these things are going to be fulfilled. I don't see how God's going to take care of me through this situation. And, Joseph didn't know how he would end up in a position where his brothers would bow. His brothers mocked him for it. Even his parents told him to keep quiet about it. But lo and behold, what God told him, what God promised him, what he showed to him, it came to pass, even through odds that seemed impossible. So let's not doubt when God promises us something, or promises to bring us through something, that He's going to be able to do it no matter what it looks like from our side. Everything is possible from God's perspective and through His power. Now, Joseph, he recognizes them, but he determines that he's not yet ready to reveal himself to them. And I think what we find out over the next couple chapters is that the reason he does this is he wants to see if they're different men. He wants to evaluate their character a little bit. Has 20 years changed them, or would they turn around and sell him into slavery 20 years later just as they did 20 years before? I think that's kind of the question on his mind, and he wants to evaluate them. So he treats them very roughly, he questions them, and he accuses them of being fakes. He accuses them of being spies who have come to spy out the desperate situation in Egypt and to evaluate, the state of Egypt and maybe how secure it was. Maybe they were from a nation that was thinking about invading, or maybe thinking about taking over this great food supply that they had. Joseph's brothers tell him that they're not spies. They're just there to buy food. And they say, we're actually all brothers. We are brothers, sons of one man. And we have another brother, actually, back in Canaan. So they tell Joseph about Benjamin. And they tell Joseph about their father. So no doubt this was probably really difficult for Joseph, and we see him responding emotionally to some of these interactions that he has with his brothers a little bit later on in the text. But they introduce themselves to Joseph as a band of brothers, and they tell him that there's another brother back in Canaan. So Joseph knows at this point that all of his brothers are alive, which I suppose would be good news to him if he's looking forward to a reconciliation. But still, Joseph is not ready to reveal himself, and so he threatens the brothers. He says, well, one of you needs to go back to Canaan and get your younger brother, and I'm going to keep the rest of you in prison until he gets back. Now, that's not the plan that they end up going with. That's not Joseph's final decision. Joseph decides, while he's thinking this over, to put them in prison for 3 days. So that's where they go. They get locked into prison for 3 days, and we'll see what happens next in section number 3, verses 18 through 25, which is titled, Joseph Sends His Brothers Back to Canaan. On the 3rd day, Joseph told the brothers to return to Canaan, to take food with them for their family that's being afflicted by the famine, and to bring back their youngest brother to prove that they're telling the truth. So he's going to let the majority of them return to Canaan and to take food, but they are supposed to return back and bring this other brother of theirs, prove that they're not spies and that they're not lying. Joseph's going to have some collateral to make sure that they come back to Egypt. Joseph planned to imprison one of them until all of the others returned. Now, it's interesting. We're told that the brothers suspected and they verbalized that this misfortune had happened to them because of their sin of selling their brother into slavery. And this is really interesting because this is seems like this is the first thing that they conclude. Why are we being treated so unfairly? Like we aren't suspicious. We're just people here to buy food. And they instantly think of their guilt. And this guilt has been apparently haunting them for years. And you wonder how many sticky situations they had been in that 20 years where they thought, oh, this is because of our guilt for selling our brother. And I believe, we're going to return to that in our application section, talk about this guilt that was haunting them for so long. But when they receive this judgment from Joseph and they realize that one of them is going to have to stay here in Egypt, they immediately say, this is because of what we did all those years ago. And they said this, and quoting from the text here, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. So we learned something interesting here that we don't read in the earlier chapters, and that is that they sell Joseph, and that as he's being sold into slavery by his own kin, he's begging them not to do this, and they're so hardened against him that they don't care. They're waving at him as the merchants or the slave traders are hauling him down to Egypt, and they're very pleased about their decision to sell him. And his begging and his pleading wasn't convincing them when they originally sold him, but it haunts them now for this 20-year period, and they even mention that little detail here as they say, all this distress has come upon us because we did that to our brother all those years ago. So they verbalize these things in front of the governor, Joseph. But they don't realize that Joseph can understand them. They think he's an Egyptian. He can't speak our language up in Canaan. And so they say this to each other, and Joseph hears it, and he understands it completely. And the reason that they think that he can't speak their language is because they're actually using an interpreter. Joseph doesn't want to reveal himself to them, and so he pretends that he's like all the other Egyptians, can't speak whatever language they're speaking up there in Canaan, so he needs an interpreter. But really, he can understand everything they say. And so when they verbalize this, this impacts him. And this, I think, does tell him something about his character as he does this character evaluation. It tells him at least that they regret their decision and that they feel bad for what they did. Their hearts are not as hard against him, hard enough to sell him into slavery and commit that great sin. So he knows at least that they are a little bit different. The text says that Reuben, who's the oldest, he responds to his brothers, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood." The text says that Joseph understands and that he has this emotional response to this. He turns away from them and weeps, says in verse 24. And he has to take a moment to kind of collect himself. It says that he later returns to them and he speaks to them again. But hearing this come out of the mouth of his brothers is probably hard to hear, hard to be reminded of. He can probably feel the emotions that he was feeling as he was begging his brothers not to sell him, and they were waving goodbye to him, and he was being carted off. And again, it does tell him maybe something that he had hoped for all of these years, that his brothers, at least in part, are reformed in their character, and they do feel bad for what they did. Joseph then imprisons one of his brothers, Simeon, in Egypt. So he draws the short straw. He gets imprisoned in Egypt, and he has to stay in prison in Egypt until his brothers come back. And they don't come back until they begin to run out of food. So they eat all their food, and then they're like, "Oh, okay, I guess we'll go back down there and get Simeon now." So he's in prison for a bit of time, the text seems to allude. Joseph tells his servants then that before his brothers go back, to fill their sacks with grain, but also to put the money that they use for payment back in their sacks. He's going to do this, and what we're going to see is that when they find this money, they're going to be really worried, because they're going to think, "Oh no, we were already on that guy's bad side, and now that our money's in our sacks, he's going to think that we didn't pay for it, or somehow we cheated him or something, and then we're going to be even bigger trouble." So let's see how that goes down as they discover this money in their bags in our final section. The journey home and Jacob's response, verses 26 through 38. So on their way home, the brothers start discovering that there's money in their sacks, and they're afraid that the governor is going to think that they stole from him. And as I mentioned, they're already in hot water with him. They're already certainly not on friendly terms with him, and they've got Simeon in jail. So what is he going to think now when we show up again? And he's like, "Hey, you're the guys who I accused of being spies, and then you ripped me off and took my grain without paying for it." When they reach home, they all open their bags and they all find their money in their sacks. And this is troubling to them and to their father, and they start recounting their experience to Jacob, their father, to Israel. And they tell him about this terrible experience that they had with the governor of the land, and how he questioned them, and how they had to confess that they had a younger brother at home. And now the governor wants them to bring their younger brother back in order to get Simeon out of jail. So this is a terrible situation, of course, for Jacob, because Jacob doesn't want to let Benjamin go. He's already lost Joseph. Now he thinks he's pretty much lost Simeon. And now they're like, "Well, just let us take Benjamin down there and everything will be all right." And Jacob's like, No, you're not taking Benjamin down there, because if I lose him, that's going to be the end of me. He says, "You're going to take my gray hair down to Sheol," or down to the grave. So they have their grain for a little while at least, but this is going to be a famine of several years in length. So they're going to end up needing to go back down to Egypt, not only for food, but also to get Simeon out of prison. So that's kind of where we're going to be picking up in the next chapters, and we're going to see further interactions between the brothers and Joseph, and this testing of their character is going to continue. We're going to see more of that. We'll see what happens as far as, is Joseph ever going to tell them who he is? Are they going to show that they've changed fully? Or are they still kind of the stubborn men that they were? And is Joseph going to end up punishing them or throwing them into jail or getting some revenge on them? That might have gone through his head once or twice. Probably not. It would have gone through my head, but I'm not the man that Joseph was in my character. So we'll see. Before I leave you today, we need to talk about our application. And as I mentioned, we're going to return to the shame of the brothers and what they did to Joseph. The application is this: your sins will haunt you in the future, especially if you don't repent of those things, those sins, and especially even more if you have to continually cover up those sins as you move and progress into your future. You think about the sins that Joseph's brothers committed in selling him. Not only did they have to live with the guilt of that action and watching their brother beg them not to do this and them doing it anyway, but they also had to live with the guilt of deceiving their father. But honestly, probably, moving forward into their lives for years to come, every time Joseph was brought up, they kind of had to perpetuate the lie with whatever means necessary to continue to have their father believing that Joseph was just killed by a wild animal and that they had no idea what happened to them and that they weren't involved in it at all. So they would have had to, kind of continue to lead him down that way of thinking, which probably would have required them to lie to their father consistently. So they have the shame of what they did to their brother, and then they have this continued shame of being dishonest, like, forever. And they're living with this burden, and a burden like that will just weigh you down and crush you if you have any kind of conscience. Joseph's brothers must have assumed that everything bad that happened to them after they sold their brother was because of their hidden sin. And they everything that came up, they must have thought, well, you know what? We deserve this because of what we did. Well, this is what we get for our sins. And never having a way to escape that kind of guilt is horribly suffocating if you've ever lived in kind of a continual pattern of sin. Certainly, the short satisfaction they got from the revenge on their brother, selling him, we hate him, so let's get our revenge and sell him. That probably brought them short satisfaction, I'm sure, but it wasn't worth the cloud of guilt and anxiety that must have hung over their heads for the rest of their lives. And that, I think, is what we're beginning to see as they are in the presence of Joseph and they are expressing this regret and this pain that they've been experiencing for all these years. The application for us is this: the decisions that you make today are going to impact your future. And certainly the last thing that you want to do is to sacrifice years of future peace for some kind of short-term satisfaction that you get from a sin today. You don't want a cloud of guilt and anxiety hovering over you for the rest of your life because of some stupid decision that you're going to make today that's going to bring you some kind of pleasure for like 5 minutes, right? That's dumb. Learn that lesson from Joseph's brothers here and don't make that mistake yourself. You'll never regret making the right decision, even if it's hard, but you'll certainly regret making the wrong one, especially if you feel you can't repent of that sin and it's something that you have to hide and cover up and lie about into your future years. Just don't even think about doing something that's going to lead to that set of actions and lifestyle. Do the right thing up front, no matter how hard it is, and then you can live with a clear conscience moving forward. So that's going to be our study in Genesis chapter 42 today. We are in the midst of it, in the drama of Joseph's story, and so we will pick up again tomorrow, Lord willing, talk about chapter 43 and figure out what Joseph's going to do in this situation and figure out if his brothers are changed men or not and how that's going to affect Joseph's relationship with them and what he's going to choose to do to them. Is he going to forgive them or is he going to toss them into the slave pits of Egypt? We shall see. Well, I hope you have a fantastic day, and Lord willing, I hope you'll join me again for Genesis 43 coming up soon.